Stefan, can you hear me?
I think I can now. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you also.
Okay, great. I finally got in.
Okay, thank you. I got it.
How do I share?
You have to activate the camera. In the middle of the page of yes,
Oh,
yes.
got it.
Hi, Stefan.
Okay, I see that. I see that as well. Okay.
Okay, we're gonna start then.
How do
Thank
I
you.
share? How do I share my screen?
Sorry?
How do I share the
Oh,
screen?
share your screen. You have on the lower corner on the right, you have a pink,
Yeah, arrow.
okay? You click on it,
Yeah.
and there is sharing, is the third icon from the
Okay.
left to the right,
Got it. Got it.
okay? Then you have sharing application or desktop. You
Shall I do
click
it now?
there. Sorry?
Shall I do it now?
You can try,
Okay.
okay? To see if it works.
Yeah. Share application screen. Yeah.
Yes, application or the entire desktop. Every application that you have open. You have those two choices. The first one is full
Oh, I
screen.
see. Yeah. Or window. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And then I click on the thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you see that?
And done. Okay. Yes, we can see
Okay.
it.
Shall I stop?
Okay.
Okay, great. So shall I stop sharing for now?
Now we have someone that is going to open the session,
Okay.
and then you can start the sharing. Okay.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. Yeah, okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, I think I've stopped.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning to you all. I think you were expecting to see Prof. Machin in person, but as we are here just to hear this keynote speech, but due to flight problems, he had to stay in London. It's a pity, but well, at least we have this technology and we can share nearly an hour. Okay. Nearly an hour with him. So I'm going to introduce him. I'm not going to read his curriculum. It's a very big curriculum, but just say a few words about him. That he belongs to the 1% of most cited economists, in particular, ranking ninth among education economists. That is why I assume that he is well known among us, at least if not in person, through his work. So he is director of the Center of Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. He is a fellow of the British Academy and has been president of the European Association of Labour Economists, and is a fellow of the Society of Labour Economists and was an independent member of the Low Pay Commission from 2007 until 2014. He's also chair of subpanel 16 econometrics in the 2021 Research Excellence Framework. And his current areas of interest include labor market inequality, economics of education, and also economics of crime. I'm talking, of course, about Professor Stephen Machin. And today we have virtually online him with us just to talk about the relation between these two research lines that I lastly mentioned, that are economics of education and economics of crime. And his speech, as you have in your programs, is education and crime, what do we know? And what I hope is that at the end of this speech, that we will know much more than we know actually. So I'm sure that at the end we will have lots of questions to ask him, and we should ask without any doubt. So without more delay, please, Prof. Machin, your turn.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks very much for a very nice introduction. I should apologise that I'm not there. I was hoping to be there, but a combination of British Airways, who decided to cancel my flight about 3 hours before it was going to take off, and maybe with a little bit of Brexit thrown in, because that's part of the reason why these things are happening. I have to apologise for not being there, which I would really like to have done. So even if I can't be there, I'd very much like to thank the organisers for inviting me to come and give this talk. Well, to now virtually give this talk, and I'm delighted to be able to present the keynote talk. So as I'm sure many people in the audience are aware, you know, the economics of education and the economics of crime, I think, are two of the big thriving areas amongst applied microeconomics these days, empirical microeconomics these days. And there's been a big upsurge of research in both of the areas. And some aspects overlap, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. There's now quite a big enough research area, I think, on education and crime to be able to kind of take stock about what we know, and to think about more recent developments. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. I don't know this system, so this is my first time on it. Okay, so I'm going to try and share the screen. Okay. Oh, that's wrong. That's not the right one, is it? No. Okay. Oh, I had it a moment ago. Sorry, I can't seem to see it here now. It was working a minute ago. Let me go out again.
Did you find the sharing?
I found the sharing, but I can't see the PowerPoint. I got it previously.
Did you close it?
Maybe I didn't. Let me try again. I'm going to try and share. I'm going to Window. Oh, I don't see anything now.
Did you close the applications?
No, I've got it on my desktop. Let me try again. I don't see all of them. I can only see the screen of where we are when I share my window. Do I have to do something else?
If you share the full screen.
Okay. Sorry about this. Entire screen.
Yes.
No, I don't see it there.
Did you open?
I can't see it to open it.
You are choosing sharing screen or application, right?
Share application stroke screen, and then
Yes,
it's not showing me. It's not showing me the applications I've got open. It's only showing me the picture we're on, the session we're on.
In the full size, when you choose the sharing application or screen, does it appear anything?
All I can see is the screen that we're on now. That's all it's offering me. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
Can you see this? Can you see it?
I can see something that's got loads and.
Yes, because it's because of the camera.
Partil.
But if you go here,
yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
and it doesn't appear anything.
The only thing that appears is the same screen as I'm on now. Let me cancel it now and go again. Okay, I'm going to try the panel again. It's not showing my desktop screen.
Okay, you can try another thing.
It did when I first came in. It did.
Yeah, you can try another thing. Below the
Okay.
sharing application or screen, you have an option which is sharing files.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, if you go there,
Yeah.
it gives you the option to
Add
upload
file.
the
Yeah.
presentation.
I'll try that.
It depends on the size of the presentation. It may take a little bit.
Okay. It's doing something. It says it's converting.
Yes. As soon as it appears, you can on the screen below. There's partilhar agora, share now. As soon as it uploads the
Okay.
file.
It's doing it. It is quite big because it's got quite a lot of pictures in it.
Okay.
It says it's converting. Okay. Share now. Shall I click on the first slide?
You have
It's
to
come up.
choose the application and then share. You have to choose the file
It
and
says
then share.
it's done that, and it's all. It says preview slides.
Did you?
Okay,
Okay.
something's happening.
It's uploading now. Okay, we have it.
Do you see that?
Yes.
And can I move it? How do I move it? Not with the arrows.
There's a below the screen. You must have an arrow,
Yeah,
which
got it,
I'm using it now also.
Okay, I've got it. Sorry. Okay,
Okay.
well, okay, it's there. And you can see it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we starting
Okay.
the sharing. We only see the sharing. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'll get going. Okay, so apologies again about that. I don't know what my computer's doing. Okay, so this is the presentation. I gave a preamble a moment ago. Okay, so by now, in the work that I'm going to overview, there's a reasonable body of evidence that shows for many different sorts of crimes, not all crimes, but most crimes, and in many different settings, that education lowers criminality. So there's a causal crime and education literature, which I'm going to refer to quite a lot as I go through, which tries to ensure that the direction of causality runs from education to crime and not from crime to education. And a lot of that work looks at what happens when dropout ages from school are increased such that people remain in the classroom at school for longer than they would have done before the dropout age reform, because of the changes to the compulsory school leaving laws that occur. Okay. What's a bit less clear, and is something I want to focus on, is why this happens and how. So there's quite a lot of different forms of research on crime and education. Some of it looks at possibilities of crime being affected by education when people are older. So it looks at the impact of completed education on crime. Some looks at actually what happens while people are still in school. So it looks at younger people. But most of the work looks at one or the other and not both together. One of the recent developments I'll talk about is that actually people have started to study both at the same time. For example, linking shifts in crime age profiles that might occur to changes in dropout age. So you can kind of think that dropout age might have a different impact potentially on different age individuals. The other recent development is that workers started to look at how compulsory school leaving laws may alter the school environment. And that's much more linked to how people do in school or are affected by education policies whilst in school, to see if there's longer run impacts, whether it could be mechanisms that underpin the crime reducing effect of education. So what I want to talk about is the origins and existing evidence in this literature, and then move to these more recent insights on the way in which education may be able to causally reduce crime. So that's the focus of the talk. I've got quite a lot of material, so somebody might want to tell me if I'm going too slow. I've got 82 slides, but I'm not going to use all of them. Okay, so here's a very stylized example of what I'm going to talk about, younger people and older people. And here we've got the education bus, the school bus, and we got the crime bus, the corrections bus, and the education bus is beating the corrections bus over the line and reducing crime. Then we got this little guy on the right who's an adult who's engaging in crime, and so we want to look at the interactions between the two. Okay, so what I want to talk about here is begin with how education functions in what we might think of as the canonical economics of crime model. That's the orthodox Becker model, where people weigh up the expected costs and benefits of engaging in crime. Then I want to move on to think about what we know from these pieces of research that have been undertaken about the longer run effects of education. So that's the impact on people who've left the schooling system. And people kind of tend to think about this as generating potentially social benefits. So if crime is reduced by higher education levels, you might think of that as generating social benefits. The shorter run effect is the second thing I want to focus on, and that's the effect on education, the effect of education on crime for people that's still in the education system. And so the way that's often pitched is to think about incapacitation. So the idea that actually if you're in the classroom, you can't be on the street corner engaging in crime or whatever. And then I want to weave into that the crime age profiles, which tend to bring the two together. And we can think more about the dynamics of crime, such that you can have a long run effect, a short run effect. But actually that short run effect of incapacitation can actually have a longer run effect as well by deterring crime for individuals who are incapacitated by crime. So that's the kind of what do we know part. That's all going to be based on existing research. And then I want to talk a little bit about current research, which has sort of moved on from that to start looking a lot more about what goes on behind the crime reducing effect of education. And so there's stuff about what goes on in schools, both in terms of education and in terms of crime. And I also want to just highlight some recent results from some current research I'm engaging in about crime and basic skills. So crime and basic English and maths skills, literacy and numeracy skills, to see from education policies whether if you're able to boost numeracy in schools, whether that can have a longer run impact on crime. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So education in the canonical economics model of crime, economics of crime model. So the canonical model is the Gary Becker model introduced in his crime and punishment work. And we can sort of think about how we can weave education into into this model. So this model says that people engage in crime if they're expected, if the expected benefits from doing crime exceed the expected costs of doing crime. So there's a kind of nice quote from Gary Becker's Nobel lecture, where he introduces this idea. So I'm going to read it out. I began to think about crime in the 1960s after driving to Columbia University for an oral examination of a student in economic theory. I was late, had to decide quickly whether to put the car in a parking lot or risk getting a ticket for parking illegally on the street. I calculated the likelihood of getting a ticket, the size of the penalty, and the cost of putting the car in a lot. I decided it paid to take the risk and park on the street, followed by I did not get a ticket. So that's the kind of general idea. Here's the more formal idea. That there's a probability that you're going to get caught, P, and your expected utility from engaging in crime then becomes a weighted combination of the gain you can get if you don't get caught, that's WC, the utility you get from that, or the sanction if you do get caught, that's being put in jail or paying a fine or whatever, S, the size of the sanction. So if you actually have a legal alternative, which is usually wages in the labour market. It doesn't have to be wages, but it usually is. Sometimes thought of as minimum wages, but it doesn't have to be minimum wages. Then the idea would be that if that expected utility outweighs the utility from the legal crime, from legality, then you will engage in crime. Okay, we can obviously introduce education into this very straightforwardly if we think about the idea that wages are higher for more educated people, but we can also think about incorporating it in other ways as well. So the obvious way is to just specify that there's a wage return to education. We know there's a massive literature out there showing that people who've got higher education levels have a higher wage. So of course that means the outside option, the outside utility, legal utility is higher for people with higher education levels. So it's going to tilt that inequality. And so you'll get the prediction that education reduces crime coming from that. So that's sort of through the income earnings effect. There are other ways that we could think that education could impact crime from theory. One of which is the incarceration stroke time availability argument that I've already alluded to. So whilst you're incarcerated in school, whilst you're in the classroom, the likelihood is, although, as I said before, some of this more recent work does talk about crime in school, but the likelihood is that while you're incapacitated, while you're incarcerated, you're not doing crime. And so that's another thing we can think of. Then there's other work about discount factors, the idea that people who are more likely to want, if you like, instant gratification, who have different discount rates from more patient people, may participate in crime as well. So workers with different discount rates may make different education decisions, and that may make them more or less likely to engage in crime as well. Empirically, all of these are subject to establishing the direction of causality. This is one of the classic examples we might think about where we're interested in the impact of education on crime, but we can also think about the relationship the other way around, because if people participate in crime in their early years while they're younger, perhaps they acquire less education as well. So we can think about the relationship going both ways. So of course, all this is subject to establishing the direction of causality. Like much of the work in the economics of crime areas, there's many other examples, one of which has been very studied, which is the impact of police on crime. So obviously, again, the Becker model would say that more police should reduce crime. But we also know that more police are put into high crime areas, for example, and so the causality needs to be unpacked to try and test the predictions of the economic model of crime. Okay, so what do we know? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the long run effect, the short run effect, and then the bringing the two together in a more dynamic empirical framework. Okay, so the first, and this is the first areas of work that the literature, the causal literature, tended to focus on. What I would say is, in sociology, criminology, and in some of the early economics work, there are quite a lot of cross-sectional regressions out there, but just run a regression of some crime measure on education. But of course, that's not addressing the causality question. The first few studies that did it are here. Looking at older individuals. So the idea here would be you want to look at people's completed education levels and then compare the propensity to do crime for people with higher and lower levels of education. So there's three examples here, all of which try to resolve, which I'll say more about this in a minute, try to resolve the causality question by looking at education policy changes related to the compulsory school leaving age. So there's a US study at the top, there's one of mine about England and Wales in the middle, and a Swedish study at the bottom. So a common feature of all of these, as I said before, is their focus on crime propensities for post-school age individuals. So for example, Locke and Moretti look at men aged 20 to 60. My paper about the UK, well, England and Wales, mostly studies men aged 18 to 40, and the Swedish paper studies both men and women. The idea in this work is that you want to look at the likelihood of doing crime for people who've got completed education levels, as I say. The use of the compulsory school leaving laws to try and leverage that relationship between crime and education. The logic for that is, the idea is that the policies were not introduced with crime reduction in mind at all. The reason why the education policies were introduced, the reason why people have increased school leaving age was to try and improve the education and skill levels of individuals. So the crime reduction that might occur because of that is obviously an unintended consequence of education policies, but one that may arise because of the change in the dropout age. So as I say, the policies weren't designed with crime reduction in mind, but they may still have an impact that comes about. And I'll show you empirically that they do in all three cases that I'm going to highlight here. Okay, so very quickly, I'm just going to skip through them really fast. There was a change in for the cohort of students in England and Wales entering the school year between 1972 and 1973. The school leaving age was raised from 15 to 16. So the idea here would be close to that for cohorts at or near that age, the affected age. You can compare before and after what happened to both education and to crime for the affected cohorts compared to the unaffected cohorts. So here's a chart just showing you a couple of things. On the education side, if you like, this is the first stage of the research design that would link crime to education. So you can see there's a clear discontinuity before and after the affected cohort. So the affected cohort were born in 1957. They will be turning 16 in the year when the compulsory school leaving age, 1972 to 73. Sometime during that school year, they would turn 16, and so they would be staying in the classroom for a year extra than the cohorts before them. So you see this sharp discontinuity. The proportion leaving school with no educational qualifications at all drops very markedly. You can see it's trending down a little bit before, but we know that education is trending up over time. But you can see there's quite a sharp drop that occurs there. If you turn it the other way around and look at the average age left school for everybody, some people stay on after the compulsory school leaving age, but that's a voluntary choice. You can see that goes up by about almost 0.4 of a year for the affected cohorts before and after. So it seems the first stage seems to work very well. And here's what happens to crime. Crime is very cyclical, we know that, and so you can see there's a cyclical pattern here. But again, you see this discontinuity that breaks the cyclical pattern. You could see that if you moved it up, it would look very cyclical, but it was a distinct drop down of about 10%. It's normed at 0 here, about 10% drop in the conviction rate of males. So if you put these together, don't know what's happened to my slide there. I hope it's not blurred on your screen. It's blurred on mine. We can see there's we've kind of got these two reduced forms that I effectively showed you graphically here, the education reduced form here and the crime reduced form here, where SL is the school leaving age. And so if you substitute the second one into the first, you can obtain a causal estimate such that beta is the ratio of the two reduced form coefficients. This is shown in a table taken from the paper here. We could just focus on one of them, for example. So you can see here, let's just focus on columns 1 to 3 for no educational qualifications. The crime reduced form, sorry, the education reduced form in column 2 shows you that education is reduced. Sorry, the proportion of no educational qualifications is reduced, so education is increased. The crime reduced goes down by minus 0.047. So the structural instrumental variable estimate is the ratio of minus 0.047 to minus 0.057, which is 0.8 here. So we identify a causal impact of crime, of education on crime, leveraged by the school leaving reform. You can treat it as a more formal discontinuity over here with a discontinuity sample, and you can see you get pretty similar results coming through as well. So this kind of pattern of results emerges in some of the other, sorry, one more thing. So if you do a cost-benefit calculation based on that, you can do so by, we can calculate how much it costs to keep children in school for an extra year. So we can figure out what the cost of an increase in education is. We can also calculate what the social benefits from crime reduction are if we use estimates of the costs of crime. So we can figure out how many crimes were reduced. It's male convictions in this case. And we can then evaluate those at the costs of crime and compare the social benefit with the costs of having children in school for an extra year. And you can see here, actually, you get a benefit cost ratio that's above 1. So if you wanted to evaluate the school leaving reform the school leaving reform age reform alone to figure out whether it yielded benefits. You can do that alone with the crime evidence, not even looking at other beneficial effects of education. There's a paper from Queensland. I'm just going to skip through very fast. This is another paper we looked at here. Here's the reduced form for crime. You can see you get a negative impact of this, both for males and females. Here's Lochner and Moretti's paper. I don't have much time to talk it through, but you can see the OLS estimates and the instrumental variable estimates when they use the compulsory school leaving reforms from different states to identify the impact, and you get a crime reducing impact, causal crime reducing impact. Here's some evidence from a Swedish study. Again, you see both a reduced form effect on schooling and a two-stage least squares effect, but reduces crime. More for men. So Lochner and Moretti also calculate do a cost-benefit calculation, and they also find that the social benefits exceed the education costs. Okay, so that's for longer run studies. What about shorter run studies? So with shorter run studies, in the short run, the main driver of crime reduction is going to be this incapacitation effect. So the idea here is you now look at the impacts of education on crime for people who are still in school. Okay. Now again, there is a direction of causation effect that may arise here as well. And so people try to leverage identification again to ensure that the direction of causality runs from education to crime and not the other way around. So there's a couple of papers that look at what happens to crime when children are unexpectedly out of a classroom. These two papers look at teacher strikes, and so they look at what happens to crime when there are strikes that shut down schools. And so they look at crime on the days when the school is shut down, and calendar year changes. So if the term dates change, you can look at what happened on the days of the year when the term date changed relative to other years before the term date change when children were in school, or vice versa. Then this paper by Anderson again uses the compulsory school leaving laws, but now looks at the relationship between dropout age changes and younger children to report what we find. All of these studies find that incapacitation reduces crime. So you also do see a short run effect of education. So there's other examples of incapacitation that people have looked at in other areas of applied micro. So there's a nice paper about conscription in the army in Argentina. So of course, conscription, when you're in the army, that's another form of incapacitation. So this paper looks at what happens when previously conscripted individuals come out of the army in Argentina, and they find that the crime goes up. But the people who are conscripted do crime when they tend to come out of the army. And there's this quite well-known behavioral economics paper about violent film screenings, that people aren't doing violence while they're watching violent films. Okay, so these are results, but I'm not going to talk you through them. I've just told you what the headline results are. So we might say, well, why does education reduce crime? So there's some recent work that I've been involved in, and I'm going to take you through in a second. We published it earlier this year. That tries to think about the dynamics of the processes that I've just spoken about, the long run and short run processes, and you can kind of bring them together. If you realize there's a kind of crime age profile that occurs across those different ages, you could think that perhaps the reforms, the education reforms I'm talking about, have potential to shift the crime age profile, and they also have potential to shift them differentially at different ages. And so you could think about how that has implications for propensities to do crime. So the crime age profile is certainly not new. At least 200 years ago, there's this French study by Quetelet where they argue that crime in early 19th century France peaks when individuals were in their late teens. So it's also true in almost all settings, the peak offending age is at a relatively early age. And so you can see for many crimes in many settings, that was an inverse U-shaped relationship, which tends to feature the idea that people start doing crime on average in their mid-teenage years. It peaks somewhere towards the end of the teenage years, and then it comes down after that. So here's an example in the US for male arrest rates between 2000 and 2010, just showing you for some of these, but they all have the same kind of structure. But this is what empirical crime age profiles tend to look like. They tend to peak somewhere in the 18, 19, 20 kind of range. There's been quite a lot of work, not by economists, but typically by criminologists, sociologists, looking at what shapes crime age profiles. And it tends to argue that there's different factors that may be affecting the three phases, if you like, of this. So the three phases are the onset of crime, when people start doing crime. There may well be a bunch of reasons why people do that. The peak, which is, you might think about people specializing in crime at that kind of area. They may decide to do lots of crimes of the same sort, or one crime of a particular sort and specializing. And then the desistance, when the crime age profiles turn down. So some of those studies are referred to here. In the paper of mine that I'm going to go through in it now, which was recently published, we use some of these insights to try and think about how shifts in crime age profiles might be influenced by dropout age reforms that occur. And what this acts to do is to link together those shorter run and longer run empirical pieces of work. Which I said at the introduction, mostly people tend to look at one or the other and don't look at both. If you look at both, like we do, that also allows us to look not just at static incapacitation effects, but if people are incapacitated at earlier ages, you may think there could be some persistence in that, but could actually generate dynamic incapacitation effects rather than the income earnings type of productivity effects that Becker tends to emphasize. Okay, so let me just run you through this quickly. So what we try to do is we try to think about differential shifts in the crime age profile as a consequence of the dropout age reforms. And so we do, with the empirical setting here is the US, where we use these use the fact that dropout age is set at state level, and so there's certain states that have changed their or indeed not changed their dropout age at different times, and so we can follow these sequential shifts in dropout age reform to study what happens to crime age profiles before and after. So very quickly, here's a sort of example. These are all in our sample. These are the changes that we look at, and so it's quite interesting if you look at the right-hand side of this. But you can see differential age changes going on. So this is quite good for our identification for thinking about the ways in which leaving age reforms, dropout age reforms can potentially influence crime. These are the ones that do it. You notice all states aren't on there, so some states don't change their leaving age reform at all over time. Here's a map, just to give a quick identification between a quick example between 1980 and 2010. The darker the color is, the higher is the dropout age. And so you can see as you go from 1980 to 2010, the map gets a lot darker over time, reflecting those changes I listed in the previous table. Okay, so what we do is we put together arrest data at county level for all of the ages of men between 15 and 24 between 1974 to 2015. And so we've got a lot of variation in the data there. We've got an observation for each age in each county over those 40 years that we're studying. Okay. I'm afraid that's blurred for me. Again, I hope it's not blurred for you. This is the kind of equation that we want to estimate to start with. This is really very much the first stage that I showed you before. This is the reduced form that I showed you before, the crime reduced form. When I showed you those structural models and the two reduced forms, the first stage being education, the reduced form being crime. This is the reduced form for crime, which is effectively one that's been used for looking at the impact of compulsory school leaving ages on various outcomes, not just crime. I showed you some of the crime studies before. This has been used very a lot in wages studies when people have tried to evaluate the causal impact of education on crime. Okay, we can hone this down quite a lot more. You saw my UK study before frame the dropout age as a regression discontinuity. We've actually got 30 separate regression discontinuities here for each of the states, so we can actually frame it in terms of discontinuities as well, so we can pin down the relationship. And then what we try to do is let the reform impact, both in initial regression and in the discontinuities, vary with age. So you notice here now we've got a coefficient that has an age subscript on it. So this is going to let us look at what happens with the potential for the crime age profiles to be shifted by the reform. Okay, so that would then be the reform impact varying with age. Okay, just to show you that this very much works in a discontinuity setting, this is all 30 reforms pulled together with the time of introduction being normed at t, and so you can see that there's a very clear discontinuity for all of the reforms on arrests in the data we've got. So crime, so the arrest rate comes down after the reforms are introduced, pooled across all ages. This is just the same empirical example to that, showing you also when you go down to a discontinuity, you see a strong crime reducing effect of the dropout age reforms. In the 5-year, plus or minus 5-year discontinuity window, you see that arrests come down by about, log arrests now, come down by about 6% on average across the 30 reforms. Okay, so what we're going to be interested in is how about 6% varies across the ages to say, are the differential shifts across the crime age profiles? Okay, here's one very clear example that they do vary by age. This is just an example down in the bottom part here, where we split the reform effects to the people roughly at school age 15 to 18, and roughly at having left school age 19 to 24 or beyond the dropout age. And you can see two things here. One, you can see that there's a crime reducing effect of the reform at younger ages and at older ages. And you can see that the effect is a bit smaller for the older ages at like 4% compared to 7% as well. So there is variations, and so there's a bigger impact at the younger ages, roughly at school ages, but there's still a crime reducing effect later on. So you can see why we're going to start thinking about potential dynamic incapacitation rather than pure static incapacitation, just from the nature of those findings. Okay, if anybody's interested, here's all 30 regression discontinuities. So of course, the confidence intervals for some of the smaller states are quite wide, but you see a crime reducing effect almost everywhere. The one that jumps out might be this one in Texas here, but that's actually the only. I should have said before, these school leaving age reforms typically put the age of school leaving up. Out of our 30, 29 put the school leaving age up, 1 put it down, and so that's quite reassuring that we get the opposite in Texas, whichever year it was, the first one in Texas. They actually reduced the school leaving age in that 1 year. So all 30 of these really point to a crime reducing effect of the dropout reforms. Here's an example of what happens to the crime age profiles. Let's just focus on total crimes. So the crime age profile before the dropout reforms is the total bar. It's the grey bar afterwards. So this illustrates at each age that you can see that there's a differential impact of the reforms. What about other effects? So this is quite important for interpreting results here. So as I said before, we can have a static incapacitation effect. We can have a productivity effect, if you want to call it that, an income and an earnings effect, or a labour market effect more generally that can deter crime. And we might have the static incapacitation effect persisting and becoming a dynamic incapacitation effect. And that's going to be a result that comes out of our paper. For these later reforms, so remember our study here covers reforms in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. The previous Lochner and Moretti work, when school dropout ages were smaller, was about the US in the 60s and 70s. So they found productivity effects. We find it very hard to find productivity effects for these later reforms. For example, there is no wage premium here, and there's a big effect on high school, but there's still an effect of crime, still an education reducing effect of high school dropouts. Why might this be going on? Actually, I'm going to flick forward. I'm just going to show what the results are here. Why might this be going on? It doesn't look like education is productive, and it looks more like, therefore, we're getting dynamic incapacitation effects. So this is probably arising because we're getting the older ages. And the other observation here is that as time has progressed, there's far fewer dropouts left in the system. So, for example, the high school dropout rate for people aged 16 to 24 in 1960 in Lochner and Moretti's group is quite high at 27%. By the time we get to 2015, there's only 6% of people there. So this is obviously shrinking the group of potential compliers by a lot. And so effectively, it's the hardcore dropouts who are left, who are probably the people who are even more at the margins of doing crime. And so what we seem to find is this persistence, such that it looks like our effects are more about dynamic incapacitation than productivity. As the dropout ages have got quite high, and in quite a lot of states it's 18 now, whereas back in Lochner and Moretti's day, or the days of their study, it was back in back at 16 on average. Okay. So the implications are a bit different on the cost-benefit side of things here. If we do a cost-benefit calculation rather like theirs for the young part, the people who are still in school, the static incapacitation part, 15 to 18, we get a cost-benefit ratio that's just about 1. So the crime reduction for the younger people just about pays for the cost of keeping them in school. But only just. The benefit cost ratio is right on 1. If you then factor in the longer run effect from dynamic incapacitation, it doubles again, because you still get a persistent effect of the dropout reforms on reducing crime at older ages. And so then you can see that it doubles basically the cost benefit, so the benefit cost ratio. Okay. Let me move to the last part of the talk. I see we're at 10 to 1, so I need to move a bit. So more recent work. I think that work, which is what do we know, demonstrates that we have a quite consistent body of research from a variety of settings that shows that education does causally reduce crime. And this is a finding that emerges in lots of places. What we don't really know quite so much is about what underpins that. And so the more recent work has started to look at questions to do with what might be the forms of education acquisition that underpin that causal impact of education on crime. So it tends to look at certain things. It tends to look at what goes on in school, and some issues might be factors that are already acquired by individuals while they're in school, aspects of discipline, and perhaps being excluded from schools, and also the amount of basic skills that people might acquire. So I really want to focus on some recent work I've been doing here, so I'm going to run you through this quite fast. There is some work that looks at the idea, some American work that looks at the idea about suspension rates of children from school, and children who are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school tend to do crime more. So the unruly juveniles, as it's put in this paper. There's a paper in Australia that looks at similar kinds of things and finds that in school, people who are engaging in school violence are also more likely to do crime when they're out of school. So things that are already being set in place in school is what's going on here, both on the discipline side of things, but also on the education acquisition side of things. So the last thing I want to show is just this work that we're currently working on now about an education policy that boosted basic skills, boosted literacy and numeracy skills in the UK quite a long time ago, back in the 1990s, in primary school. And so what we do is we've got extremely rich administrative data where we can follow the children who were in those literacy and numeracy programs relative to similar children who weren't, and look at the impacts on crime subsequently. So this sort of builds upon other areas of work in the economics of education. Some of the work about early childhood programs, about education policies that occur. There's a few very small scale studies. I mean, I guess most people have seen some degree of the work, a lot done by Heckman and colleagues on peri preschool, which is a very small number of people who are affected. But almost all the benefits of peri preschool come from deterring crime later on, from early age intervention. So I have this paper with Sandra McNally and Matteo Sandi, where it's not actually a paper yet, but we've got results which we're writing up soon. So there's these two primary school programs that were introduced in the 1990s in English schools, the literacy hour and the numeracy hour, and they were introduced with the recognition that English and maths teaching were not perhaps working as effectively in primary schools. Children go to primary schools age 5 to 11 in England, and they were introduced to try and boost the quality of teaching in English and maths. And so what happened relative to before, when teachers could effectively teach whatever they wanted in the English and maths lessons, they were given a much more highly structured form to teach. So, for example, the literacy hour, we have a clock here which shows what happened in the hour, and so teachers had to provide teaching in this kind of form through the hour. So, including individual work, so independent reading and writing and words stuff, vocabulary was stuff that children did, but also some aspect of group work as well. Same in numeracy. I haven't got a clock here, but actually much more structured teaching was the order of the day in these two programs. So Sandra and I have an earlier paper where we just looked at I hope this isn't blurred again, it's blurred on my screen. You can see the equation again about what we're going to do. We're going to look at the impact of the introduction of the literacy NLP, which is the literacy program, NNP, which is the numeracy program, and we're going to look at one in a sort of staggered difference in different setting about what happened, because the introduction was staggered, both to literacy and numeracy, or maths and reading, but then also studying longer run effects on crime. So Sandra and I already have a paper where we looked at the short run effects on the literacy and numeracy. On the literacy, the paper's called the Literacy Hour, where we find that that English test scores were boosted, and they were boosted more for disadvantaged children. So that's going to be an important point for the crime angle. Have we lost my tables here? Can somebody in the audience say or online?
We can only see there's no tables.
Yeah, and is that blurred?
Yes, it seems like it's double copied.
You see what I see. Maybe it's because it's a big file. Okay, I'm going to have to tell you verbally what we find. I have the titles. I'm sorry about this, but I'll tell you verbally what we find. So what is true is that if you look at the children who are treated by both literacy and numeracy hour, they were much more disadvantaged. So we have to spend the time getting a sensible control group, which we do. But before the policy's introduction in 1997, it was introduced in subsequent years. They were more disadvantaged. If we look at the impact of literacy and numeracy on test scores, so Key Stage 2 is the test scores that children take at the age of 11 at the end of primary school. So they go to primary school from ages 5 to 11. There's 2 key stages in the English, in the UK, well, in the national curriculum in England. Key Stage 1 from 5 to 7 and Key Stage 2 from 7 to 11. So they take Key Stage 2 tests at the age of 11, at the end of primary school, in the basic elements of maths and English, and they do science as well. Our earlier work showed that the literacy hour boosted Key Stage 2 English scores, and it boosted it more for disadvantaged children. This table, this invisible table, shows that it does the same in the study that we're looking at. The data is very similar to what we used in my earlier study, but we didn't have the long run outcomes. It's true if you do that as well. It's true actually if you go and look at Key Stage 4, the end of age 16, at the age 16 when the compulsory school leaving age, that the literacy hour and numeracy hour still boosted scores then. So there was a long run education impact, a longer run education impact of the literacy and numeracy hours. If you look at crime, we find a crime reducing impact overall for all children, but we have a quite interesting gender dimension to this. So we find that the literacy hour reduces male crime, age 16 to 25, and the numeracy hour actually has a significant negative impact on female crime. Now this is quite interesting because if you go back and look at back in the 1990s, girls were already doing better than boys in English. There's a long run trend about girls doing better than boys. So the more disadvantaged group there were the boys. It wasn't true back then, even though it is true now, that girls are doing just as well at maths. Girls were doing worse at maths than boys back then. And actually, we find that a boost to math skills from the numeracy hour does reduce female crime as well. So there isn't a quite interesting gender dimension to the findings. Okay, so we have, so why my basic skills results are the only ones that have disappeared, I do not know. Anyway, so we think this is quite interesting to add to recent developments on the reasons why education impacts crime. The idea that basic maths and English skills are a predictor of crime subsequently is really quite important for education policy having a potential impact on crime and what the benefits of that kind of education policy might be. I have one more slide where we've also started looking at some things in related question in Brazil, where we have a large-scale early childhood intervention as well. And we've also found some crime reduction from that. Here's a chart showing the impact on homicides late at age 10 to 15, which is not innocuous in Brazil, I'm afraid, because crime starts early. But we find in our treatment control estimates, we find a crime reducing effect to this early age program as well. Okay, let me wrap up. I've got 2 slides of conclusions, one about the what do we know, one about the where the current research is going. Okay, so we have quite a lot of evidence now that dropout age reforms, that increase the school leaving age, that direct education policy interventions continue to reduce crime in lots of settings. And we have these presence of these shorter and longer run crime effects that we see. It would be nice to have more evidence on the relative balance of the two. I'm hoping there's going to be more research coming out in that domain. And indeed, on the mechanisms, which is where things do seem to be moving a bit. So boosting human capital of children in the childhood years seems to have reduced youth criminality in the examples I've given here, both the short run and the longer run. And I would think that it'd be very interesting if we can start to see more about these within school and indeed preschool education policies having scope to reduce crime as well. We know the lack of basic skills in some countries has been a key issue in the policy agenda. The UK and the US in particular have a very long lower tail of poor basic skills compared to other countries. If you look at the 2012 PIAC data that the OECD collected, about the literacy and numeracy skills of adults. It's quite interesting that I think it was 26 countries in there. That might not be quite right, but I think it was 26 countries in there. But in all but 2, if you break down the distribution of literacy and numeracy skills between older people, it's a cross-sectional survey of adults, so age 16 to 64. So if you look at the lower tail, bottom end of a distribution, literacy and numeracy skills of people aged over 30 and under 30, in all but 2 countries, that improves in the sense that the younger people have less basic skills problems than the older people. The 2 countries where it's exactly the same and hasn't shifted over time are actually the UK and the US. And so there's been big problems in basic skills acquisition in those countries, which we know matter for a whole range of outcomes in later life. I've chosen to focus on crime here, but it matters for a lot of other outcomes in later life, economic and social outcomes as well. So this I think is where part of the literature has been moving to. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'll try and stop sharing the slides if I can. I don't know how to do that. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, I've managed.
So thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. So the problem with the slides, but anyway, we could follow you, and I'm sure that there might be some questions here, and if anybody wants to ask Professor Machin something. Okay, I think I start. The first thing, I was wondering when you were presenting the first slide that when in the tables they were showing data related to persons, most of times they were talking about men and not about women. And I was wondering, is there any problem with women's crimes? Do they not commit crimes? That was the first thing. And then another thing I was thinking about was that I want to congratulate you because of the last research you are doing, because for me it's very important to pay attention to what happens on the early childhood. And as you mentioned, crime has this inverse U-shaped, so it's interesting to make this slope not so high, not so skinny. So I find that a very interesting field of research. And that's all. Thank you.
Great. Should I respond?
Yes, if you want.
Okay, cool. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they're both very, very good points. So the gender thing, yeah. I mean, women do crime. We know that. Some of the early studies tended to not look at women so much. I mean, female crime was as a share in the past was quite a lot lower, but we know as time has progressed actually that the share of female crime has been going up. It's still relatively low in all crimes, but there are some crimes. So actually, shoplifting is a good one, a good example. So there's quite a lot of shoplifting is women rather than men, for example. I think the rationale in some of the earlier work was partly because it did make connections to the labour market. So a little bit like, if you like, as a comparison with a lot of the work on wages in the past, where female participation rates were lower. But most of all the recent work actually does look at both men and women, and as the share has gone up. There's also an associated literature that looks at crime convergence between the genders, which is quite interesting. We know that actually in many countries that the labour market opportunities and the education levels of women have improved over time, although they've hit glass ceilings and they've certainly plateaued out in some places. Which you might think that if labour market opportunities improve, that should reduce crime. The Becker model does sort of say that, but actually female crime has been going up as well, and so the share of female crimes in total crimes, it's still well below. It's still 20%, I think, in many countries, but it's been going up. And so there is a bit of a literature out there about gender convergence in some crimes as well. Some of the interesting work on gangs in the crime area talks about female gangs as well as male gangs. I mean, and so that's quite interesting. And I fully agree with you. These shifts in the crime age profile, driven by education policy changes, or indeed other changes, are really quite vital for thinking about how we can try and improve outcomes for youth that they may persist in the longer run.
Any other question here?
Yes, first of all, congratulations, Professor, for your presentation. Very interesting and motivating for the future. No? We have a lot of work in this topic. And I'm very interested to know if you know about the heterogeneous effect in two ways. I'm thinking about the different typologies of education and the different typology of crimes. Because are you speaking about crime in general? But I'm very interested about what is best. No, what type of education could be have a more impact on the different type of crimes? I'm thinking about trying to interpret your presentation in order to define the future public policies. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very good question. So the focus I've chosen to emphasize here is definitely education policy. So two things in response to you. Definitely there are crime policies, of course. There's, you know, that can have a direct impact as well at different ages. So there is some research out there that looks at what happens when the age of being defined as a juvenile and an adult changes. There are pieces of research out there that looks at what happens when sentencing guidelines change. So if you alter the mandatory sentence for a particular kind of crime. And then there is all the work about what happens for people who go, if you like, all the way through the criminal justice system and end up in prison, and about what scope there is there for rehabilitation when people come back. So actually prison learning programs are really quite interesting as well. So what happens to people if, you know, can people engage in learning programs while they're in prison or jail? So the dropout stuff is quite, in the US, is quite important. So there's the equivalent, the GED, the generally equivalent diploma is often taken by people by dropouts who left school in the US without any educational qualification, and so they sometimes get the GED whilst in jail as well. So I think prison learning programs are potentially quite important as well. So it's not just about policies in school, even though we're obviously going to be interested in that for the next generation of adults. There's also the kind of policies, both crime and education policies, amongst adults as well, who may have low education levels and who may have engaged in crime. I hope that answers the question. I think it was that kind of heterogeneity the question was about.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I've seen that you have made a huge work in this area. I was wondering what kind of differences would you expect, for example, in countries where the opportunity cost of studying, for example, is compared to, for example, criminal activity like drug dealing or something like that? What kind of differences in your results could you expect in those countries? For example, even if students get, I mean, students do not need so much level of education because they have this alternative of drug dealing or something like that. What could you expect from these countries? That's my question.
Okay, I couldn't hear that perfectly, but I think you're asking me about what happens if in countries where people might have other options at an earlier age to leave school, and so therefore they would acquire less education. I think that would mean there's more scope for dropout reform ages if, and this is an if, you want to boost education levels, which may have a crime deterrence effect. I guess you might. I think you're talking about situations where people might go into child labour, where child labour laws also are at a much earlier age, where you were able to work in at an earlier age. I think that's the question you're asking me about. So, what literature in the countries that don't have earlier age child labour laws, the US, the UK, Sweden, and what I've focused on, does seem to suggest there's more benefit from these dropout age reforms at the earlier ages, when you go up from 15 to 16, say, rather than 17 to 18, if anything. And so that would apply in most settings as well, I think, if that was viewed as something that people would think would be desirable to be boosting the education levels of the whole population. It would be great to see some more of these studies in lower income countries actually, where dropout age reforms have occurred as well. If anybody in the literature knows about any of those, please point me in my direction. Send me an email about them.
Okay, any other question? Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just wondering if you can elaborate more, or you have more information about what happened within the school when these compulsory laws go up. I just wondering that given that these kids stay more in the school, it makes sense that crime go down. But then what happened, for example, for measures within the school, like conflicts and bullying and these kind of things? I don't know if there is a literature working on that part, and that would be very interesting to explore. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Australian paper I skimmed over quickly, the one by Beaton Kidd and Sandy, does look at that. They look at issues of in-school violence and in-school crimes, and they also look at the potential effects, the peer effects of that as well on other children. That's also been studied in the analogous literature in the labour market and the research designs are very similar to look at wages. That's been studied quite a lot more about the idea about does keeping people in the classroom who've got lower education levels and might not learn as much, does that have a detrimental impact on the other children in the classroom? And I think most of that literature, if I'm right, says that the peer effects from that are fairly small, negative peer effects from that are fairly small. But we need more research on that, I think, as well.
Any other one? Okay, so I think it's time. So thank you very much for this presentation, for all inconveniences with these empty slides and so. If you don't mind to send us this presentation so that we can see it properly, it would be perfect. And thank you again. It's a pity not to see you face to face, but anyway, maybe we can find you somewhere else.
Yes, I mean, thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't get there, and I'm sorry about the blank slides, but it worked out. It worked out quite well in the end, I hope. And as I say, it'd be great to come another time. Yeah, it'd be really good. Mm-hmm. But things conspired against us this time. But I really enjoyed giving the talk, and thanks for the questions. And thanks for inviting me. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference as well.
I think. And now we have time to go to lunch. Okay.